Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Z, and welcome to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, I am speaking with the absolutely brilliant psychotherapist and author, Israa Nasir. Israa is the author of this incredible book, Toxic Productivity. In this episode, we get into what is toxic productivity? How do you identify it in your life? Once you identify it, what do you do with it? And how do you kind of shift gears and move towards a more kind of fulfilling life? A little bit about Israa. Israa is a New York City-based psychotherapist, writer, and author of Toxic Productivity. She is also the founder of Well Guide, a digital community for mental health awareness. Her work is centered on transforming the way we talk about mental health, taking it from a place of shame to a place of empowerment. A Pakistani-Canadian child of immigrants, she has specific focus on mental health, identity formation, and healing AAPI first and second generation immigrant community. This episode is definitely one you do not want to miss. It is filled with actual tangible behavioral steps on how to move forward alongside these kind of inner critic narratives that we all have. Hope you enjoy. Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Z. Welcome back to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. Today, I have a brilliant guest with us. I am super excited to talk to you today. We have Israa Nasir, who I just loved picking your brain last time we spoke. I think you talk about something that, and I'll let you address it, but I think you talk about a topic that is something we all can relate to in different degrees, obviously. But when we talk about it in the context of relationships and in the context of, just kind of living what I like to say, not a happier life, but a more fulfilled life, it's something that really hinders that. And so I'm going to hand it over to you. But I do have your book here, Toxic Productivity. And I'm going to let you take it away. Just kind of introduce yourself and who you are and a little bit about your book before we really kind of get into it.
Well, thank you for having me. I remember our previous conversation. It was so robust that we were like, we got to have a part two. And so I'm excited to be here. For the listeners, my name is Israa. I am a therapist and an author of the book, Toxic Productivity. I'm also a speaker. I do a lot of corporate workshops and wellness workshops for organizations. And my core desire in all of the different things that I do is that I want people to have the education and awareness of mental health dynamics. And, my book is very much focused on what are the underlying unresolved, unaddressed emotions that we are all kind of like running away from that drive this unhealthy need for achievement and external validation. And so it's about how do you separate your self-worth from the things that you do, and what is the role your emotions play in that. Now, I just want to quickly say that productivity doesn't just refer to work. In our hustle-oriented world, productivity is a measure of love, relationships, personal health, personal growth. All of these domains of our life have been now kind of wrapped with this productivity oriented mindset. So it's something that I think for me it's really salient in the work that I do with clients, in myself. A lot of this book has my own journey, and then also in just like people I speak with, just day to day.
So my first question to you, when you say that we all go through, because we do, when we all go through this, whether it is with work or in relationships or just in general, what we take on internally and externally, all of these things, where would you say, I think this is what people have these are actually some of the questions that I got when I had posted this on Instagram the other day. How do you know when you've crossed the line from being productive into that category where it's now hindering elements of your life, or now it's causing dysfunction? How do you know you're there? And what are some indicators that you're on the way there so that we can kind of prevent that?
There's this really impactful quote by Carl Jung. I think it's Carl Jung. And it says, the poison is in the dosage, something like that, or the poison is the dose. And so essentially things that are good for us in balance become bad for us when it's out of balance, whether it's too little or too much. Really good example of this is water. You can actually have water poisoning if you drink too much water in a short amount of time. And we know dehydration will also kill you. So in the same way.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know you could get water poisoning up until
I
like
was just
5
going to
years
say,
ago.
I didn't want to interrupt you and I also didn't want to sound like I didn't know what I was talking about. But I remember this so clearly. This was like 20 years ago. I remember hearing this on the radio. That's how you know it's long ago. I remember hearing this on the radio, and they were talking about this contest that they had through the radio station about how much water you could drink, and people were calling in saying, "Don't do that," and somebody actually died.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I learned about water. I had no idea. Who knew? Yeah. I didn't know.
A lot of people die in music festivals.
Yes.
Drink too much water.
Yep.
So PSA, drink a balanced amount of water.
Yes.
But productivity is the same. If you do too little of it, you will be underfulfilled. Mm-hmm. And if you do too much of it, then you become toxically productive. Mm-hmm. How do we know we are kind of towing the line between healthy and toxic productivity? It is in a couple of ways. One is your intention behind the productivity. If you don't know why you're pursuing what you're pursuing, or if your desire for the pursuit of productivity or achievement, or I really want this, or I really want that, is because of an external reason, somebody else is doing it, your coworkers are doing it, your parents are telling you to do it, our friends bought a house, so we must buy a house. It's arbitrary. Like if your intention is arbitrary, outside, external, that is a big red flag that what you're pursuing is unhealthy. If you are only prioritizing achievement and deprioritizing other things, so social connections, relationships, your health, if you're constantly too busy to eat lunch, or your life is so out of balance that you can't make nourishing meals for yourself, that's a time to sit back and take a look at your calendar and say, am I overcommitted? What can I actually let go of? And this is applicable to anyone and everyone. Some people have more privilege than others. I completely understand that. I'm a child of immigrants. Like I know what it means to hustle hard and work 2 jobs and do all of these things. But in your downtime, how are you utilizing it to nourish yourself if you are overcommitted, or you have to be because of life circumstances? Another really, really big red flag of toxic productivity is feeling disillusioned. So you feel very disconnected from life. You feel very disconnected from the things that you're doing. It feels like you're just floating through life. And in the book, I refer to it as autopilot. And in my conversations with you earlier, you refer to it as, what was it, like leaving the building?
You check it. Yeah, you left the building.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the same. It's like you're kind of disconnected, like your mind is somewhere else, your body is somewhere else, and your soul, like your emotion, is somewhere else.
Yes.
So I would say those are some 3 big ones to look out for.
I love that. One of the things you mentioned that's really important, I talk about this a lot with the work that I do, but looking at the function of behavior, or the underlying why the behavior is occurring or not occurring. And, you talk about that, what is the function of why you're doing what you're doing? What's the underlying reason? Yes, we know you're doing X, Y, and Z, but why? And this kind of gets into that kind of inner critic voice that I want to kind of focus on, that sometimes is that driving force behind why we do these things. I would tell people, let's say that they are, let's say, I want to give something unrelated to work. Let's say that they have very traditional roles in their household, right? And they're very stuck on, this is how I need to be in my relationship. This is how I expect you to be in the relationship. And this is how I expect our relationship to go. There is a distinct process and I expect us to follow it. When you ask people, why do you feel that way? And we see this a lot with traditions and kind of these kind of things that we've hold on to for so long, whether it's religious or just family related, but these customs that we have, or these traditions that we have, if you ask yourself why, well, why do you do them? Let's say it's unhealthy at this point. Why do you do it? I don't know, because I always have. But why? I don't know, because I always have. If the answer is continuously why, or because that's all I've known, and there's this obvious kind of gap in what you do versus what's out there, I think that's something to kind of call attention to, that there's no rhyme or reason why you do it, except that you've always done it. And sometimes when you find that that's your answer, I don't necessarily say that people have to change it, but it's something to be curious about. That's what I always say, that it's something to kind of, The other thing I want to respond to that you said, the letting go of the stuff that's weighing you down, and whether that's emotions or it's tasks or whatever the case may be, but letting go of the stuff that is now holding you back from being productive, whatever that stuff is. And even when it's unhealthy, we would think that we want to just kind of brush our hands of everything that's unhealthy, but it doesn't work like that. In fact, we hold on to things that are unhealthy because they're familiar. And even though they may drag us down, at least we know we're experts in how we're being dragged down. At least we know we're experts in dealing with the things that are familiar to us. So if you could talk a little bit about, if people are listening and saying, I want to get rid of so much, whatever that so much is, but it's hard to let go because it's a control thing. I feel more comfortable with it. What do you tell people as far as how to look objectively at the harm it may be doing to the productivity in their life?
I think that it's really hard to look to and observe objectively what is causing you harm. I think it can be easier and less painful to first objectively look at everything that you're actually doing. Right. So like actually just doing like this like global scan or audit
Like a
of
life
your
assessment almost.
life assessment,
Mhm.
an audit of time,
Mhm.
just or energy audit. Like you can whatever form, but like some kind of awareness of where your energy is going, what you're saying yes to, what are the things you like doing, what are the things you didn't really like doing. So like the way I did it for myself was it just made a list of everything that I was saying yes to, and then next to it I just made like a little like, did I like doing it or not? Right. How did I feel before? How did I feel after? And then I noticed that there were some parties that I was constantly going to that I was consistently feeling bad after leaving, right? About myself and like my life and all that stuff. And then there were some friends I was hanging out with where I really felt like it was a drag to go there, but I always felt better afterwards. Immediately, now I don't have to think about it in this like, how am I self sabotaging? Now I can just think about like, wow, like I love hanging out with these people. So how can I turn the dial up on that? And that can be the same for house chores. It can be the same for work stuff. And when there are things that you can't get rid of, then you have to kind of do something that therapists call benefit finding. It's an exercise you can do, we do with our clients when clients are stuck in a situation, barring abuse, because that requires different strategies. But if you're in a bad workplace and the environment is toxic and you can't quit your job because you just can't, right? Because you need the money, job market is garbage, all of that stuff. How can you find the benefit in this situation for yourself that will set you up for your next thing, that will set you up for your next achievement or next job or anything like that, right? So I think it's really important. But yeah, and I think that can also really help you feel less overwhelmed when you look at this life audit. Because what, I talk to people and I'll say, how can you create pockets of time in your schedule? Well, I'm too busy. I have to do these things. If I don't do it, my friends are going to do it and I'll be left behind. If I don't do it, other people are going to think I'm like a terrible parent, and it's like, how do you actually like dissolve this myth?
Yes.
Is by actually looking at what you're doing.
Yes.
And finding some control in a situation that feels out of control.
And I also tell people too, along the same lines, that you can't think your way out of this. You have to actually do the behavior or test out the theory that you're so scared to test out, to give yourself the opportunity to see that nothing bad happened. And then it makes it more likely that you're going to do it again. So you don't go to this friend's house, you realize that it's draining you for whatever reason, and then you don't go, nothing catastrophic happens. And so the next time that it comes up, it's a little bit easier now to decline the invitation, right? Because you saw that not only did nothing bad happen, but you were able to put that energy and effort into something that you actually value, into something that you actually gain benefit from. And so, while it feels hard to give up something that's so familiar, or it feels hard to give something up because you're petrified of the response you're going to get, or you feel you're going to, upset the person or disappoint the person, test it, right? And you see that nothing happens. And if you wait to do it until you feel comfortable, we know this, you'll never do it. So it's kind of like you have to do it and at the same time be nervous. So when you're in that moment, let's say, and you have this inner critic that you talk about, and I want to read one line from your book about what is an inner critic. I want to talk about that because I think that really kind of takes us into that realm of where do we get our inner critic from? Where does it come from? And a lot of the times, most of the times, it really stems from our upbringing and the narratives that we were sold and the narratives that were pushed upon us, healthy or not, accurate or not, but just those types of narratives, and kind of get into how parents shape our inner critic. And how people can identify, one of the things that I do too is, people, we all, myself included, we all have these narratives about ourselves that were told to us, right? And the problem with that is if my parents, who I'm supposed to trust unconditionally, if they tell me the sky is purple, why would I think anything different? And let's say you're telling me, nope, sky's blue, and nope, sky's purple. Why on earth would I believe you over what's being told to me, embedded in my brain, for better or worse? And so it really does a lot of damage to have this inner critic be our guide in our life if it's toxic.
100%.
Yeah, again.
Yeah, and it's not just the parents. Like, I think it's our parents, it's siblings,
Yeah.
it's early educators.
Yes.
As far along as probably high school, because our brain doesn't stop developing until we're in our early 20s.
Right.
So I think it's like a lot of like the important people, like it can be our cousins, it could be a neighbor, but it's like not only are the messages that we're told, but
and
the
society
that we see.
Yeah. Yes.
Like what are we actually seeing? Maybe our parents are telling us that, you should do like, you should say no, like say no more, like when we're children. Let's say they're teaching us that, but we never see them say no.
Correct.
We only ever see them say yes and
Love
then
that.
be resentful.
Love that.
Right? So we're going to learn that. We're not going to learn
that.
what we should say.
Yes. Did everybody hear that? That's so important. If you take anything from today, take that. That's so important. We forget about that all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
But I will say one thing as well, like, like as a therapist, like a lot of my work is around parent stuff. It's just like, that's what happens. Right.
Yeah.
But I always want to empower people in saying that, whatever has happened with our parents provides the context for why we are the way we are, but we get to choose what to do with that as adults.
Absolutely.
Like it's a choose your own adventure. We have been given the context, and then we kind of have to do something active and engaged about it.
Yes.
So even for me, like, I really grew up in a home that didn't model a lot of rest. And not because my parents are like bad people, it was just their lot in life that they learned from their own experiences, that you've always got to be working, moving, hustling.
No,
and
well.
Yeah. And so it took me till like probably like my early 30s to unlearn that. But that was work I had to do myself, because they're still like that.
Yeah.
They have not changed.
They're not going to change. It's funny. I remember this was after grad school. It was like had just started working. And in addition to being a psychologist at a hospital, I also taught a ton of undergrad classes. I was an adjunct professor at like 3 different places, and I was always teaching. I was running from one place to another. It never occurred to me. And and I know people are saying, like, what do you mean it never occurred? It never occurred to me to stop or drop a class. It never occurred to me.
Yeah.
And I can't even tell you now why it never occurred to me. It just never occurred to me. It just wasn't even an option that I was refusing. It just never even occurred to me. Yeah. And I just remember one day driving, and I remember saying, I was on the phone with my husband. I was like, I'm so exhausted. I don't want to go teach anymore. And I remember him saying, "Who's this?" So don't. I was like, what? And then the next semester I dropped 2 classes. I had horrible guilt. I felt so guilty, so much shame, but I felt like I got my life back. And then I got mad at myself that it never even occurred to me that this was even a thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like,
would you ever get mad at a child for not knowing something they have no
nope.
business knowing?
Nope.
Like, you'll never be mad at a 4-year-old for not knowing what gravity is.
Correct.
Yeah. It's not common sense. Like, it's like if you were raised in a certain context, like also our popular culture, you're not going to know it. It's not common sense.
No.
It's
no,
just
it was amazing. It was so basic, but it was it was so complex at the same time. So I just want to read this really quickly. Again, I'll hold your book up, Toxic Productivity. And I'll link it too as well so that people can to get it. So our mental world is largely made up of speaking to ourselves about ourselves. When the self-talk is positive and uplifting, it can help boost our self-worth and emotional resilience. However, when the self-talk is negative and critical, it can diminish our mood, self-worth, and sense of confidence. In short, it becomes an adversary to healthy productivity and instead encourages toxic productivity. That is such an essential component to this because 2 things. One, it isn't difficult as it may be. It makes you realize that you're the one who's kind of doing it to yourself, right? Without blaming yourself, but but the flip side of that is that also means that you are in total control of being able to stop the pattern. So it's not that I'm blaming ourselves. It's kind of like what you said. Here's the context, here's the context. Here's the narrative you were given. I always like to say it's kind of like a buffet, like at the casino, right? So like you love breakfast buffets. What's better than a breakfast buffet? But you've always gone to the pancakes. You've always loved pancakes. But now you have this buffet in front of you and you're like, oh, wait, I can also have waffles. I can also have cereal. You may still always go to the eggs or the pan or whatever you're familiar with, say as pancakes. You're always going to go to the pan, especially in times of stress when you have very limited time. It's too much to decide. So you're just going to go to what's easier. You're going to go to the pancakes. But then you realize when you do have time and maybe you taste a bite of the eggs and you're like, oh, I actually like that. Let me try a little more. So it's kind of like that. But I want to talk about the inner critic, where it comes from, why it's there, what we do with it. And the idea that I always tell people, it doesn't go away. It's almost like it's like almost like a reflex. It's like it always may be your initial response to something, but there's this power in the pause, and you're able to look at that inner critic voice with your other voice, and then see that they're kind of separate, and then make a choice based on that, rather than just hearing it and running with it as truth.
Yeah. I think that, so to start right off at the foundation of it all, the inner critic is just the way through which we see ourselves, the standards we set for ourselves, how we demand that we show up in the world. And it is an inherited set of beliefs and ideals through, like we just talked about, early childhood experiences, predominantly your parents, but other people as well. And a lot of us grow up in this mentality of tough love. You have to be mean to motivate yourself. So our inner critic is often like trying to protect us from pain. So it serves a purpose. Its methods are to scare you so that you don't do anything, right? So the inner critic will terrify you of trying new things by telling you that you're a failure. You're a failure. Don't try this. You're a failure. Because what it's trying to do, trying to protect you from the pain of putting yourself out there. And so when you start seeing the inner critic through that lens, you can have a little bit of compassion for yourself, because you are trying to protect yourself. It's just the method is not very great. It's not like a helpful method, right? And so the first thing is it's really important to become aware of it. Many of us are not aware of that constant running stream of consciousness as being something that is outside of us. We feel like it's us, like it is us, like I am my thoughts, like I am my emotions. But the truth is that these are thoughts that are coming to you, and these are emotions that you're feeling. So you are like the recipient of it. It's not who you are. And so becoming aware of what it is, how it shows up for you. What is the quality? Like, is your inner critic more anxious or is it more aggressive? Is your inner critic passive aggressive? Is your inner critic like always telling you that other people are going to think you're stupid? So getting like an understanding of the flavor of your inner critic
I
is
love
important.
that. You know, I always focus so heavily with people on the what is being said and the why it's being said. I never really focus on like the vibe of it.
Vibe, yeah.
I love that. I really love that, because then if you're in one, if you have one vibe going on, it's actually a really helpful tool to be able to differentiate that narrative's vibe from your vibe, because then it actually gives you the ability to be objective, because it's two different things at once.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Yeah, you are essentially, I mean, the exercise is that you make a list of all of your thoughts, like you keep like a little thought record. It can be as simple as bullet points on your notes app. It does not have to be complicated. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And then like you kind of track it for like a week or 2 weeks, and then you go back and then you kind of like reflect on themes, and then you pull a character out of it. Everyone's inner critic is a character. Like it has a vibe, it has a personality. And this is helpful because you'll start to notice that maybe the inner critic has these characteristics that you don't like. You don't want to be around. You would never tolerate another person, and you certainly would not tolerate in yourself. So let's say your inner critic is very like passive aggressive. You might not want to be a passive aggressive person yourself.
That's right. That's right.
So in understanding that, it helps you create the opposite character, which is the inner coach. Who is the person you want in your corner? What are they like? And then you kind of build up that voice. And you're right. It doesn't ever go away.
Right. And I think that's important.
I think that's not the goal.
For people to know, because I think a lot of times people assume if they can't get rid of it, it's still a problem. And that's not true.
Yeah. The work is in how you respond to it. The work is in, can you differentiate yourself from it? And the Elizabeth Gilbert writes this in Big Magic, which I thought was like an excellent analogy. She's talking about fear, but I think it applies to this as well. So imagine, your life is a road trip, and all of your emotions are like your road trip buddies. And fear, in the analogy, she's talking about fear, but I'll talk about the inner critic. The inner critic is someone who's always going to be there for the ride because it's a protective mechanism, right? But how can we make sure that the inner critic is maybe not in the driver's seat? Maybe it's in the passenger. Maybe a couple of months later, you move it back to the back seat. And then eventually you put it in the trunk. So once in a while, you'll hear the thumping. It's going to show its like self. But as long as it's not in the driver's seat, you're good.
I love that. It's, it's that, we talked about this before, the acceptance and commitment therapy kind of approach to things where, the goal isn't getting rid of what comes up for you. The goal is acknowledging that it's there for what, showing up for what it is. And at the same time, continuing to do what you need to do. It's not ignoring it, but it's also not taking it and owning it. It's you being able to look at it. Right. So I want to kind of take this idea of this narrative and this idea of, expectations of ourselves, and expectations that either we have of ourselves or others have us, or expectations that we think others have of us, and how that translates into toxic productivity, but within that kind of family dynamic. Let's say it's coming from, it doesn't have to be narcissistic parent, like we said, but toxic parenting styles, whether that's neglect, whether that's the golden child, whether that's the scapegoat type of parenting, whether it's, somebody who has extremely high expectations where your love is conditional on your productivity or your achievements. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays into the family dynamic? Because I know a lot of people listening to this podcast come from family dynamics where one parent or both parents, could have been narcissistic, didn't need to be, or just neglectful, or just shitty parents.
Yeah. And you know what, that actually exists and is out there, even though I think as a society, we never want to accept that.
Correct.
But I mean, in my work, I think predominantly when I work with people, they're coming in because of some familial foundational
Yeah.
issue. And, when you see a lot of this like overachieving, using productivity as a coping tool for validation and connection, usually the parents are either having some form of narcissistic tendency, perhaps not the whole personality disorder, or most of the time fall on the spectrum of being an emotionally immature parent. And there's like 4 types of emotionally immature parents. One profile of the emotionally immature parent is very much focused on what are other people going to think? How does this look to the external world? Very oriented, hyper focused on image and, image management, which you see in narcissistic people as well.
Yeah.
And so when you grow up in an environment like that, the first lesson is that achievement is safety. If I can give you the thing that you are demanding of me, then I'll be okay. You'll either give me love or it'll prevent you from yelling at me, right? It's either seeking or protecting from. And
I mean, that's the hallmark of people please. I mean, that's why a lot of times in abusive relationships, people have this misconception, and they're not wrong, but they're not 100% accurate, where, people please within narcissistic dynamics because, they want to please the other person, or they want the other person to think fondly of them. But really, it's also a lot about avoiding punishment, avoiding abuse, avoiding something bad. So they do these things for the other person. So maybe, just maybe, they won't be bad to you.
Yeah. It's a way to exercise control.
Yeah, very much.
In an environment that is giving you no control. So how can you at least control this other person's reaction? These are all the things I have to do to make sure that they don't react aggressively.
Agree.
And so, so I think when you grow up with parents who fall on that spectrum, you develop a lot of perfectionism because it's being demanded of you. You become completely afraid of failure. You realize that the only way somebody will accept me is if I am giving them achievement. And achievement doesn't only mean school or athletics. It can be anything. It can be silence. It can be, obedience. As long as I'm giving you the metric of success, I'll be fine. You will love me, And so then you internalize that as an adult into being hyper achievement focused, like really connected and committed to perfection, and you care a lot about other people's opinions. You let that drive a lot of your decision making. But on the back end, you have a lot of shame. You have a lot of guilt, and you struggle with these like difficult emotions, and you don't know what to do. And so all you know is to keep doing things, keep moving. And it becomes like, survival. Like I think a lot of people utilize productivity as survival because it's avoidance coping.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting when for people listening, because I'm glad you keep saying this. A lot of the questions we got were work related. And it's interesting because I can understand why, but I think it's important to address that it's, not just literal tasks that you're getting done. So I want to give somebody had asked a question. It was actually interesting, and it was about when productivity is viewed in different ways. And this was specifically about the push for this person to get married and have children. And I thought that was really interesting because I don't think people look at that in terms of productivity. But if that is what is considered successful, right? If you're raised to believe that if you are not married by the age of 22, you are utterly useless in this world. And if you don't have kids by 24, forget it, you're done. Like there's no point to your existence. And, I'll never forget one time at my wedding, I'll never forget that somebody came up to me, and I got married really late. And somebody was like, oh, like, finally, like, and I remember like,
oh, that's so rude.
Right. And I was kind of like, at first I didn't even interpret it as rude. It was almost like in their eyes, that was their definition of success, which I knew about them generally, but to actually hear it in that way was so like, like in their eyes, I wasn't a complete human being. I wasn't a successful human being until I was married.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, it definitely is something that affects all domains of our life. I
Yeah.
think because there's the word productivity in it, people often think it's work related. But the way our entire society is like configured at this point, everything is a measurable metric of
Yes.
success. And
Yes.
so this toxic productivity is a mindset
Yes.
that your purpose is to achieve a certain measurable outcome. And
Yes.
that can be marriage, children, buying a house, looking a certain way, your relationship status, what your home looks like, what your vacations look like, your work, job status,
Yep.
salary. And now even self-care can
Yes.
be completely dominated by this achievement oriented mindset,
Mm-hmm.
biohacking, measuring everything, like,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you're only a healthy person if you do ice baths every day along with the infrared sauna. If you don't, you are not it.
You're
And
not it.
so, yeah, so I think
I'm
that
not it.
you're not, I'm certainly not
I'm not
it.
it.
Um, so I think the thing is, it's this black and white mentality.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the either or, you're productive or you're lazy. And
Yes.
so, and that makes people really miserable because you know what? We are so friggin' dynamic. Like we
Mm-hmm.
are this multifaceted, complex brained individuals on this earth. Like
That
we are the
changes
only,
constantly.
yeah, but we are the only animals that have the complex
Yep.
brain, the
Yep.
front brain.
Yep.
And we're all just like worried about whether or not we're meeting all the check boxes.
I
Like it
know.
just feels like a waste of like this like evolutionary thing. We can create art and dream and make music. And we're all like, oh no, I have to be married before 30. Like what a distillation of a
Correct.
beautiful, beautiful life that we've been given.
That is so well said. Like like that just nailed. I mean, that's so beautifully said. Truly.
Thank
Because
you.
it's just so smart the way you put it because we are just stuck in this, you know, it's just the way we measure everything is just it's just so unbelievably wrong and it leaves no room for any type of variability or creativity. And the parameters that we use, they're not even established by us. Maybe
Yeah.
we agree with them, but they're created with people that sometimes we literally have nothing in common with. We have no access to the things they have access to, or we're not even interested in what they're using. And so that dichotomy of, either we succeed or we fail. One, I always say this, our brains are lazy. It likes to take a shortcut. It's way easier to think in all or nothing terms, right? When we're stressed, we do all or nothing. When we're angry, all or nothing. The gray area is extremely uncomfortable and uncertain. And we don't like that as human beings because we're creatures of habit. But I think what people miss is that you can still make your definition of productivity in whatever capacity it is a pattern, right? Like and I think that essentially is what you're talking about is when you kind of retrain your brain into focus on things that matter to you, where you really want to spend your time, and you do it more than once, it becomes a pattern. And then you start to retrain your brain, retrain your emotions, but it really has to start with the behavior, or else you can't think your way into a pattern, right? You actually have to do the work. And I always, start small. um but talk a little bit about when we have these toxic dynamics within a family, and you have a parent who is there's always one parent who's the owner of the information, and then you have the other parent who just accepts it and then just disseminates it, right? Or you have two parents that have opposing information and they're constantly butting heads, and then it's the messages you get are chaotic. But let's take this type where there's one parent who sets the narrative, who sets the course. You have the other parent who enables that narrative, as unhealthy as it is. You as the child take this narrative on yourself, whatever that may be, about you, about how you see yourself in relation to the world. And this is kind of your playbook, right? Can you talk a little bit about what goes on in somebody's mind when they hit that point, usually sometime in early adulthood, once they've left the usually the literal house, right? Whether they move away or whatever the case may be. what's the struggle? And I say it's a struggle because it's a struggle. What does the struggle look like, feel like when they realize, oh my God, wait, that's not accurate? Because I see this a lot with like, let's say unhealthy relationships where the person realizes eventually that relationship was not what it was supposed to be. I've lost all faith and trust in my concept of love and connection because the rug just got pulled out from under me. So if we kind of translate that into these inner critic voices and schema, whatever you want to call it, that you then take into adulthood and you hit that moment where you realize, wait a minute, I don't have to act like this, or wait, that's not true. What happens? Because I'd imagine there's a lot of guilt that happens, especially when it goes against what a parent or a family has always taught you, a lot of shame, a lot of hiding who you are, hiding what you want. So can you talk a little bit about that and what you see with your clients?
I think you definitely named the top two, which is shame and guilt. We definitely feel like we are abandoning or betraying our parents. It's very painful for anybody to come to recognize that they are surpassing their parents in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in emotional maturity or finances, whatever it is. Like there is this like moment, and it's like a moment of transition in any young adult's life where they're like, oh, I've surpassed my parents a little bit. So there's that. And then there's also a lot of grief. I think you have to make space for the grief that comes with realizing that the messages you learned were harmful, that, you felt as you start to do this exploration, you might have memories of feeling invalidated. They might surface up. Things you've not thought about for years will come up and be like, oh, you'll start to realize moments where your parents couldn't meet your needs, or they, left you feeling neglected or abandoned. But at that time, that was your norm. So you didn't know that it was harmful, right?
Correct.
It's only in retrospect that you're looking back. So there's a lot of grief. And grief first shows up as anger. And right.
I was going to ask you, what do you do with the anger aspect?
What do you do with the anger? Do you lash out? Do you process? Like, what does it even mean to process anger? Yeah. And so like, there's a lot of like emotionality. It feels like very like turbulent. And unfortunately, it kind of overlaps with a life transition where you are going in from like young adulthood into adulthood yourself. And so friends are changing. Some people are getting married. Some people's parents are dying. And you're like, oh my God. And so it's a very chaotic time. And I think in that moment, having routines is really important, as simple and basic as it sounds, but it is really helpful to have a routine, like a daily routine. It doesn't have to be a complicated 7-hour thing. It can be, so your mind has some, familiarity in your day-to-day. In that routine, building in the habit of self-reflection. When you're feeling good, when you're feeling not so good. I think building a habit of self-reflection leads you to the number one skill you need to make it through this time and most of life is emotional regulation.
Yes.
But if you're not self-aware, if you don't introspect regularly, then you are not going to be able to regulate emotions, because in times of distress, you're not going to be able to stop and pause and breathe and rationalize it. Like, you just won't be able to do any of that because you're not used to doing it. So practice in peacetime. So that means daily check-ins with yourself. 3 simple questions. How am I feeling right now? What do I need right now? When was the last time I ate, drank water and moved my body? 3 questions. If you can just get in the habit of asking it once a day.
It's right. I don't even want to know the answers to those questions. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, oh my, I don't know when the last time.
No, but you know what I mean? And
yeah, absolutely. It's so important. It's so important. And this is what we do for a living. And I mean, and for people listening, understand, like, it is difficult. And this is what we do for a living. Like, this is what we help people with. And yet, we have trouble. It's not 100%. To your entire book, literally, the purpose of it is not to achieve a level of perfectionism with this.
Yeah.
It's to engage in a process that is allowed to fluctuate based on your needs at any given moment, right? Which is why it's so important to be self-reflective, because, I mean, I don't know about you, but I wake up one day and I need something very different on Tuesday than I do on Wednesday. I may need something different Tuesday 8 a.m. than I do from Tuesday 10 a.m.
Yep.
And that's okay. And so to hold on to these things so dearly and these messages to just constantly overachieve and overcome and over everything, it's not possible, right? There's no end point to that.
It's also not helpful.
No.
It's not possible. Like, it's also not helpful. And so, one thing I say to people a lot, and people almost have like a fatalistic allergic reaction to this. And I probably would have if someone told me this like 10 years ago, which is, can you embrace being mediocre somewhere? Like, exactly, right? Like, it makes me want to cringe on the inside. But it's true. Like,
it's so true.
Can you find the good enough point for everything? Like, just a good enough point for this email, good enough point for the workout, good enough point for the type of friendships you have or what you do or what your vacation looks like. Like, find the good enough point, and then anything beyond that is extra. And that can really help you find balance.
Yeah.
Just as a total side, I've been embracing this concept of mediocrity quite a bit in the last year. And I wrote 2 newsletters on it. One is like the good enough point, and one is how can you embrace mediocrity?
Will you send this to me so I can post them for people? Because I'm thinking, like, I got to read this.
I mean, you might just like reading it. You don't even have to share it with others, but writing about it made me feel more comfortable with it. So I wrote about it for myself.
Yeah.
And then I was like, let me just put this on Substack. It's one of the free articles. I was like, anybody wants to read it. But it was really like I wrote it for myself, because I struggled with that. I mean, as a millennial, I was raised to believe that I was exceptional, and therefore everything I did must be exceptional.
Yes. Yeah.
And
it's exhausting.
That's the way to live. Yeah.
It's exhausting. It's interesting. This is totally unrelated, but related. One of my son is a junior tennis player, plays tournaments and is pretty serious about it. And one of the things his coaches tell him repeatedly is that he has to get good at winning by playing average. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that for a second, and I remember immediately I wanted to be like, who the hell told you that? No, you need to go out there, you need to fight, and kind of to what you're saying, and this culture that we live in where everything has to be over the top and you hustle till you die.
Yeah.
It puts you in such your fight or flight is high. I mean, everything's heightened. You can't perform like that well. Yeah. And so to be okay playing average, to win playing average it's so less like, I don't know, a weight lifted off your shoulders. It's the same thing for weight loss. They tell you, stop trying to lose weight. Instead, try to maintain where you at. And people ended up losing. I mean, there's something to be said for that. And I think that's so important. But that concept of mediocrity, because of the culture that we live in, it's like your immediate reaction, which is my immediate reaction too, was like, that's unacceptable.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah. You and everybody else. And me too. Like, I have to work on this a lot, but I love that advice from the coach. Is, you know why? Because it's also sustainable.
That's
you
the
can
key.
maintain average for so much longer. And if you can find a way to win with average amount of effort, like that's the dream.
Yes.
Like, why do we have to be miserable? I don't understand.
I don't either. I don't know. But this was so, I mean, I could talk to you for hours about this because it's so, what you write about, what you talk about, it's so intertwined in literally every single thing we do. And it's so, so important. Tell people where they can find you and find your book, Toxic Productivity. Tell people where everything is.
So my website is like a wealth of information. It's israhnasir.com. Under the book section, you'll get more info on the book. I have a lot of resources like worksheets and stuff and the resources. So if you ever want to engage with more, it's there. And then I'm very active on Instagram. It's at well.guide. So if you ever want to shoot me a message, I'm the one who is often in the DMs. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, this was amazing. And thank you so much. Like I said, I think you're just brilliant. And I think the way you explain concepts are so relatable. You break things down so easily. You don't make it all complicated and psychobabble. And it's just really good, very relatable, and very easy to follow, and extremely it's just not as overwhelming, I think, as other I don't even want to say theories, but other kind of strategies and self-help type stuff. It's just so easy and it's not scary, which I think is super important.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you.
A fun convo.
This was great.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Next Up Narcissism. I hope you found it useful, but most importantly, I hope you found it validating. Want to work one-on-one with me? Visit my website at drjamiezuckerman.com to book a personalized coaching session, and be sure to check out my on-demand workshops on topics like co-parenting with a narcissist, life after leaving, anxiety management strategies, and more. Again, that's drjamiezuckerman.com. You'll also find links to my interactive workbooks, merchandise, resources, and newsletter sign-up. Next Up Narcissism is as much your podcast as it is mine. I want to hear your feedback and what you want to hear. So make sure to leave a podcast review wherever you listen, or send an email to nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Again, that's nextup@drjamiezuckerman.com. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Make sure to tune in next week to see what's up next on Next Up Narcissism.